Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Madly Learning. Tonight, we are going to go over the top 5 tips that I use to save time lesson planning. As teachers, one of the biggest things that takes up the most amount of time in our day and probably causes us the most amount of stress is the time it takes to plan our lessons, implement our lessons, and then mark our lessons. So I wanted to talk about tips that I use to streamline this process. It doesn't mean that we are completely prep or plan free, but there are some things that we can do so that we can get some of our free time back. As teachers, we often work ourselves to the bone. And this is not healthy for us. It's not healthy for our families. And it really isn't something that we should strive to do. Working harder doesn't make you a better teacher. So we need to look at ways that we can still deliver engaging and effective programming in our classrooms without having to sacrifice all of our own personal time in order to do it. So here are some of the tips and strategies that I have used in my classroom so that I can be able to spend some time with my family after work is done. The first tip that I have is to make a routine. Routines help us to be more efficient because we're not starting at zero. In lesson planning, when we have an established routine that's predictable, that we follow each and every day of the week, we know what we need to plug in. Think of it like a puzzle piece, where you can construct the outside edges and fill in some of the middle of that puzzle. And simply all you need to do each week is plug in those changing attributes every single week. You already have the plan and structure in place, and you simply need to insert the activities that you are going to change out every single week. For your language arts, the routine that I like to follow is I always start with independent reading. Number one, this will give me a buffer time with my students to allow them to do something independently while I can finish up and get things ready and organized for the period. All I need is about 10 or 15 minutes for them to be reading independently so that I can make sure that I have all of the materials laid out, ready to go for that day's lesson. Then, once we are finished independent reading, I move into a teacher-directed lesson. Now, these are mini lessons, and it's relating to the topic that we're going to cover that week. And I will do this every single day. So have a 20-minute teacher-directed lesson. And I even go so much further in knowing that what each day of the week, what that teacher-directed lesson is. Then I will have independent activities. Now, this is where I do centers. Now, for centers, I don't mean that I have a physical space in my classroom that students move around to. For me, centers is more like activities that students complete weekly, and they do one of those activities each and every time they have independence centers work. So centers is less about the structure and location and grouping in my classroom and more about there's a choice of activities that they need to be engaged in weekly. Then I will move back into a teacher-directed lesson. Now, I always structure this as the first teacher-directed lesson is related to reading, the second teacher-directed lesson is related to writing, spelling, or grammar. And in each and every week, I structure it so Monday is the same type of lesson each and every week. Then I move back into independent activities, and again, we bring back in these centers. They're the same centers they did in the first time. They're just doing another one of the activity centers during the second time. This means that throughout the entire week, I am planning one set of centers activities that they do for half of my language block. This means that I only have to plan it once and they do it all week long. That allows me to make sure that my students are engaged in 40 minutes or more of independent activities that I only have to plan once. Now, what are the types of tasks that I do in that routine of my teacher directed? I did say that I cover the same type of lesson, and it's very much a plug and play where I will need to grab the resources, but I know what kind of lesson it's going to be. So while the material may be different, the delivery of that is very familiar. When things are in a routine, it makes it that much easier to get it going and started because you're not starting from zero every single time you begin to plan. So when I'm doing independent activities, students are going to be writing. Now, I don't do anything for their writing. Students choose what it is that they're going to write about. They choose what form they are going to write in, and they begin to write. This is easily accomplished, and there is zero prep for me. I simply need to train them at the beginning of the year as to how to do this. I provide them with a choice board that can be changed up weekly or even monthly, and students will select topics from that choice board or they have free choice. This means that for the 20 minutes that they may be writing every single day, that's 20 minutes that I don't have to have anything prepped and planned for because the students are doing the work here. We also have reading responses. Now, I double up my reading responses and have them respond to the readings that I'm doing in both my shared and my guided lessons. Now, the reading responses, what questions they're responding to, are again from a choice board. Using these choice boards allows me to have to plan one choice board. I can use the same choice board for an entire month or more, and students simply are required to select a different question each and every week that they need to respond to. This means that they're doing the work, and the only required prep that I need to do for that choice board is to create a new one every month instead of every week. Now, I'm also going to do some grammar lessons. Now, granted, the grammar lessons are going to be a bit more prep because I will need to actually pull the grammar out of the reading. What I do for this is I take a text feature. So I will take a portion of my read aloud from a picture book that I'm reading or even a novel that I'm reading, and I will use that to demonstrate a different grammar concept. So it's not necessarily about worksheets. I don't need a lot of prep here. I simply need to find the passage and write it on a chart paper, or I can write it on the board. And I can often have this selected ahead of time and write it out while they're independent reading. Spelling. Spelling is another area where you can get your students to do a lot of the heavy lifting. If you are using differentiated spelling lists, you can provide students with a selection of words in which they can choose their own words, and you can have a set of activities like a choice board that students use to practice their spelling words. If students are choosing their own spelling words, or you are helping them choose their own spelling words weekly, they can work through these familiar activities, which means you're not prepping and planning different worksheets that they need to use every single day. It's a routine that is set up so they take different spelling words each and every week and run through these practice activities. You can also have your students test one another on their spelling words, or you can test them as well, but you can have them test one another and then fill out a sheet that tells you what their mark was. This will save you planning, prepping, and marking time if you get your students to work on some of the heavy lifting here when it comes to these activities. Now, for the teacher-directed aspects, I structure my teacher-directed activities fairly simply, and it's the same thing each and every week. Now, these are the examples for what I would do for the reading section. So I do 2 teacher-directed. This is what I would do for the reading section. On every Monday, I will read the picture book read aloud that I've selected for that week. Tuesday, I continue reading the picture book read aloud. These 2 days, again, require zero prep because I grab a book and I read through it. And then I have questions that I can answer. Sometimes I just simply do it on the fly. Sure, sometimes it's better that I have read the book ahead of time and I will mark it with some sticky notes for questions, but sometimes I don't have time for that. So I know the book that I'm reading, I'm familiar with it, and I will simply read it on the fly and pause and stop for think alouds as I'm doing it. And that happens, and I stretch it over 2 days because that's 2 days that I have less planning. Now, Wednesday, I will have a planned and prepped lesson for a comprehension activity, but I do try to minimize how many times that I am going to have a printable activity. I don't want to have to recreate, reinvent, or make a different activity for every single Wednesday. So I will try to use activities that require a minimum amount of materials, such as asking questions, having students work in groups with partners. Although that might be difficult at this time, they can turn to an elbow partner and have a conversation with them about the activity. We can do something whole group on the board, which requires me to not have very much prepped ahead of time, but we can simply just have that conversation and do it together. Those types of activities where I'm not having to create something every single week definitely saves me time. Thursday and Friday are both related to the shared reading, so I will have a shared reading text. Now, I do have to pick a different shared reading text for every single week, just like I have to pick a read aloud. But there's so many great books. I can simply find a shared reading by picking a newspaper article or a different article on various places on the web that I can use a shared reading activity, or use a comprehension activity where we are talking about how we understand the text. Now, this is the same structure that we follow in Ignited Literacy as well, to simplify what happens every week to help you cut down on that prep. Now, math can also be structured in a routine as well to help save you time. Again, if you are starting from scratch for every single lesson, that's a lot to think through. If you think back to Teachers College, where we were planning these huge, elaborate, like 7-page lesson plans, that takes a lot of work when you're starting from zero. By putting things into a routine, it allows you to cut down on some of the prep and planning because there's more time that you will feel comfortable with how to structure that lesson. Just like I do with language, I will start with a warm-up activity. This is the bell work. This is most often where I'm using my differentiated daily math pages with my students, that they will come into that math class and begin on that differentiated math page, and they will work through the front side. Now, the front side, again, is the same page often every single day, but the numbers and the complexity can change because you can differentiate it for your students and you can change it each day. But because the students are familiar with it, it is something that you don't have to teach them every single day how to do it because they're familiar with that routine. It also means that you can copy enough of those pages on one day because you know that it's going to be the same for the whole week. Now, once they've completed that, I will take the word problem that's on the back of those differentiated pages, and that will form the basis of the teacher-directed lesson. I will either explicitly teach a concept to my students, or we will do a math talk, or we will work through a problem together, the problem that's on the back of the differentiated daily math pages. We will work through that problem together. Those are the 3 different types of options I will have for those teacher-directed lessons. And then finally, we will move on to math centers. And similarly to my language centers, my math centers are the same each and every week. And I try to select activities that have choice boards because it allows for a model where all students can be successful if you have some choice built into these activities. It also means that I don't have to do quite so much prep and planning because I have, number one, open-ended activities for students that can join in at different levels. So I'm not planning multiple levels at the same time. And it also means that because I have a choice board, I'm not planning each and every day. Same activities that students will cycle through all week long. Instead of planning for each and every day as a brand new lesson, planning in a week allows you to get through some things a little bit more and spend less time prepping and planning for them yourself. And finally, the last portion will be consolidation, and this will simply be the reflection activity of what did we learn for today. Now, sometimes these go over a day. They last longer than a 60-minute period, but this is typically the method that I follow, the routine I follow in my math classroom that allows me to fill in the blanks every single day, which cuts down on some of that prep and planning. So for some of the independent activities, again, for their centers activities, I will do math activities where it's knowledge and understanding type questions, question and answer, rote practice. I still think that's really important, so I will build that in, and I will have to generally get an activity page for this. But again, that will last me all week long. So one activity page all week long. Then we'll do word problems. Again, I'll put a choice board together and I'll pull word problems from different resources that I might have. Use some of the word problems from the differentiated daily math that we are not using for teacher-directed lessons. I will use those as well. I will have a technology center. And this, if you have technology in your classroom, this is a great time to do boom cards and allow them to use boom cards as practice for various concepts in math. And then finally, hands-on, where we're working with manipulatives. Now, sometimes I would substitute the technology piece with the work with teacher, and students would come and work with me in guided math. However, this year, I put technology there because I'm not sure how much guided math might be actually happening in classrooms this year without the ability to pull students to a small group area in your room. Now for the teacher directed, again, we have lesson, and then I'll do some modeling, and then for consolidation, it's reflection on learning. So that was one tip, is planning it in a routine. My next tip is don't do it all. So can you make it? Don't photocopy it. A lot of the times what I see is teachers photocopying things because it will make it easier for students, because they might take time to create it themselves. So sometimes it just feels easier to photocopy all of it. By photocopying all of it, you're making your work harder, which means you need to come up with the activity page that they are filling out. And then you need to print it, photocopy it, and have it prepped and ready to go. That eats up a lot of your time. So if they can simply make it on their own, then you don't need to photocopy it. And certainly, it's not going to be pretty in their notebook. It might be messy. But the reality is that they won't always have an organizer from you in which to use when they need it. So sometimes it's best to teach them how to make their own organizers and how to structure their page and how to organize their ideas in ways that works for them without relying on external papers. And also means you have less paper in your classroom and less things to prepare and prep. So here are some examples. This is an example. This fiction summary is from my Ignited Literacy program. I provide all of the organizers that you would need. However, I do encourage people to not use them. They're there so that a teacher can see what they look like. But a student can very simply make this T-chart for themselves in their notebook with a ruler and a pencil. They don't even necessarily need to divide it. They just need to use the S, the W, the B, the S, and the T, and then answer it next to that word. It's a lot easier and less prep if you show them this and show them how to make it in their book, and then they use that and create it themselves. It means you don't have to go into that document and print it. You don't have to run to the photocopier and make 30 copies before your next lesson. And the time it takes you to do that, you could spend doing something else. So it's more efficient to get your students to do the heavy lifting. Now, for some students, this might be difficult. You might have a few students where this is part of their learning disability that this would be a huge struggle for them. For those students, you may want to have it accessible, but I find that a lot of them can make it their own. And for the couple that can't, it's easy for me to just simply go and create that easier. It takes less time to create this organizer in 3 kids' notebooks than it does to run to the photocopier, print it for 30 kids, and then come back to my classroom and make sure it's ready to go. Here's another example of a reading response page. So often I will see in classrooms, I will see teachers that will have a page with lines on it that students are responding to something that's been created or photocopyable. This is a great use case for why we can simply just use notebooks. Certainly, the printout page will be better organized, but you do have to teach your students how to organize their notebook, and sometimes that's frustrating. Often, many of us are visual and we want it to look pretty. The desire to make it look pretty wastes our time. It doesn't have to look pretty to be effective and pedagogically sound. So in this case where you have this paper with lines, if you have access to notebooks and your students have the ability to use a notebook, save yourself some time in planning by making them write their response in a notebook instead of on a photocopied paper with lines on it. And again, another example, these 3-column charts are popular for so many things. We don't need to print out a very simple T-chart or a 3-column chart in order for our students to get the gist of this organizer. Now, this example is exactly why we want to teach our students how to organize on their own, so that in the event that they are beginning to write something and they need to organize their ideas before writing, they don't need to come to you to get an organizer in order to be successfully organizing their work. They can make it themselves. It takes a bit of time to get them to do it well. We have to give up on the fact that it might not always be neat, but it is more efficient for us and for our students to learn how to do it without relying on a photocopied piece of paper. It's not necessary. So that was tip number 2. Tip number 3 is combine and divide. Now, this is specifically for my split grade teachers and looking at saving yourself some instructional time by looking at places where you can combine the 2 grades curriculum and you can divide it up efficiently. So the first is, what topics should you be teaching together in your split grade? Definitely all of the other subjects. Math can be taught together, language can be taught together, and art, drama, phys ed, health may need to be separated depending on the category, but the one that you want to flip-flop your instruction with is going to be science and social studies. It is really difficult to teach 2 grades, 2 different sets of science and social studies topics. I highly recommend that you use a flip-flop method with your split grade classroom, but just for this topic area. Number 1, save yourself some time and only teach science or social studies. Don't teach science and social studies in the same week if you're responsible for both subjects. It increases your planning time exponentially and your prep time, so try to do it one or the other. Now, when you are flip-flopping with another subject, you need to look at what your students can do. Now, I've talked before about how building independent work skills is possible with almost all different types of work groups that you might have, all different types of students. Even if it doesn't seem like they can right now, most students, I would say 90% of students, can work independently when the work is at their independent work level. If you are having a hard time with students not being able to work independently, simplify the work that you're asking them to do independently. Now, the other alternative is, instead of flip-flopping with science and social studies, where you're teaching science to one grade and the other grade is independently working on science, try to flip-flop with another activity in another subject that students can work independently on. Most students can work on art independently. Some students can work on writing independently. When you have that going, they can just get down to business and write. You can flip-flop your science and social studies instruction with other topics that your students are more successful at working independently at. If that means it's going to be reading and reading response, then have them independently read a reading response to the article that they read and flip-flop your science with that topic that the other grade can do. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because science sits on your schedule, it doesn't always mean that everybody has to be doing science at that time. But flip-flopping your science is going to be more effective than trying to teach 2 sets of science curriculum at the same time. Now, the next activity that I would recommend is planning your lessons not for a day, not day to day, but planning your lessons as a big picture for the whole week. So we want to look at what is it that we want to accomplish this week instead of what do we want to do tomorrow. When we think of our lessons week by week and chunk them week by week, it's easier again to fit them into that routine because we see it as a bigger picture. So if you think about, are you seeing the forest or the trees? We want to look at the forest, not the trees. So planning day to day means that you could be spending more time planning because you're starting from zero every single time. Whereas when you plan for the whole week, you know where you're going. You have a strategy in place, which means that throughout the week, you can just fill in that strategy. Now, it also allows us to design a pathway that our students are going to follow and how we're going to get there. It allows us to use activities, centers, and choice boards that last a lot longer in our classroom. And if things can last longer, it takes us less time. And it allows us to see the connections between the different activities that we are doing. And when there's connections and crossover, it means that we can more efficiently, that one lesson can cover multiple expectations instead of having to plan a lesson to cover a expectation. Now, when we're planning for a day, some of the downsides to that are that we are planning, but there might not be a connection between our lessons from day to day. So again, it means we're starting from scratch. And whenever we start from scratch, we take more time. It also means that we're looking at the little ideas instead of the big ideas. So when we don't see the big picture, it's hard to have those ideas linked together. So our lessons don't necessarily flow from one lesson to another. So we are, again, having to retrain and reteach our students how to do different activities because they've not done them before. It also means that if we are planning daily, we are planning every single day. So instead of carving out a chunk of time to plan for your whole week, we instead are planning each and every day. And if we're using those little ideas, we're planning these whole lessons each and every day, which ends up actually taking more time than if we took a chunk of time and planned out our whole week and the big idea. So we don't have to have everything, but we're looking at the big idea and simplifying the activities we do and putting them into a routine that we follow, which means that our students need less training so we can get through more in less time. Last but not least, let's not reinvent the wheel. Pretty isn't pedagogy. If you are spending a ton of time making the worksheet or activity pretty, remember that that is taking you a lot of time to do, and it's not necessary. Students don't need pretty. And it's hard for me to say because I like pretty. But if it comes down to you getting it done or you're spending extra time to make it pretty, skip making it pretty and save yourself some time. It's not necessarily going to bring about a better result for your students. Next, do what works. So if it works, do it. You don't have to do things in complicated ways if it's not necessary. Finally, you need to evaluate the amount of time you are going to spend on planning and prepping activity versus the money it would cost you to purchase the already done solution. Many times, it's often easier for me to purchase something for $6, $10, $15, $25, or even $100 because the amount of time that it would take me to do it myself is not going to be worth that time investment for what I'm going to be able to get for that money. If I value the time that it takes me to prep and plan, and I can use the money instead to save myself some time, then I will. Now, every single thing that you could possibly purchase definitely can be done yourself, but you need to evaluate whether or not the time that it takes you to do it yourself is worth the investment of the money for you to purchase it already completed. And finally, it's keeping it simple. If a solution that you can find is easier, do that. If the solution you want to do or you've dreamed up doing is complex and complicated and is going to take a lot of time that you are not willing to invest in order to do it that way, give yourself a break and don't do it. Give yourself permission to say the simpler is better because that's what I need right now. I don't have the hours that it's going to take to create what I need to create. Many times people will ask me, well, how do you do it? How do you have Madly Learning, work as a teacher, and have 3 kids at home? And the answer is, I don't do it alone. Madly Learning is my business. The things you purchase from TPT are part of my business, and I have a team that helps and supports me to be able to deliver that content to you. It is not something that I do all on my own, and I would never expect a teacher to be doing that on their own either. So when you see a Madly Learning worksheet or a unit or an activity and want to try to recreate that yourself, please remember that all of that resource, all of that activity that was created is not done just by me. I have a team that supports and helps me to be able to deliver high quality, engaging, and publishable content that other teachers are able to use. So I hope that I've given you some ideas on how you can save yourself some lesson planning time, and so that you can get some of that personal time back. If you have any questions for me, I would love to answer them. Drop them in the comments below and we can chat more about your time saving tips on how you can save yourself some lesson planning time. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you want to learn more about Madly Learning resources, please go to www.madlylearning.com/shop store. Thanks so much for joining me, and we will see you next Monday night for another episode of Teaching with Madly Learning. Bye for now.